I mean, we're here to talk a little bit about historical fiction, and I guess the thing that I want to say is that I never planned to write a book of historical fiction. I felt more as if I somewhat dropped down the rabbit hole. This was going to be a novel about a daughter trying to understand her father, and as my agent will comment, no, it was an 850-page sprawling multi-generational family saga to begin with, and it started in 1915 and it ended in 1968. And as time went by, it was like shrinking it in the wash. I feel like I kept putting it on the hot cycle and it kept getting smaller and smaller, and the daughter dropped out. And more what became the focus of it was the period of Prohibition and jazz. And as I started to do the research, I found myself sinking more and more into that world of the jazz age and jazz itself. I thought I could have picked an easier subject like quantum physics rather than trying to learn so much about jazz in that period. But, and my character is actually a jazz musician, and sometimes I thought to myself, couldn't he raise goats or do something else? Because it just was very hard to try to imagine what the world of a musician would be like. But in the end, I read everything I could about jazz, about Chicago, about the Prohibition era, Al Capone. I loved all the research. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning. And the book begins with the sinking of the Eastland. Now, the Eastland is the forgotten tragedy, certainly of Chicago and maybe of the United States. More people died in the Eastland than in the Titanic. More passengers died. I'm just going to tell you a little bit because I'm not going to actually get to the sinking of the Eastland, but what happened was the boat was unstable, it was unmoored in 20 feet of water, it was too many people on board, and it turned over in the Chicago River in 20 feet of water and sank, and the people, 844 people drowned. So it's a terrible, terrible tragedy, and one of the reasons people don't know about it also is because all of the people on the boat were workers for Western Electric. They built the cable that Thomas Edison used for the first transcontinental phone conversation, and they were going on this picnic because Western Electric thought it would be a good idea for them to celebrate. So I will say that Western Electric, after the tragedy, did everything it could for the survivors, and it actually had an exemplary record in terms of its labor assistance and so on and so forth. I spent a lot of time in the Chicago Historical Society looking at things with white gloves on, and anyway. So I'm just going to read you the first couple of pages. It was a hot July morning and the Green River stank. The Onion River, the French called it. The Potawatomi named this place Chickagoo after the garlic that grew along its banks. As Benny walked to the bridge, he had to hold his nose. A light rain fell, but he didn't care. He heard the music before he saw the big ships, and it made him pick up his pace. Pausing on the Clark Street Bridge, Benny took his time. A parcel wrapped in brown paper dangled from his hands. Though he was short for his age, he had a sturdy chest and arms that seemed to reach the ground. His hands were big as catcher's mitts, and he swung his parcel to the beat. He was late, but he didn't care. It was Saturday. Time to be in the vacant lot playing ball. Time to make deliveries was what his father said. Benny stared into the churning waters which flowed west toward the Mississippi, not into Lake Michigan as nature had intended. In 1900, the year he was born, engineers reversed the current to make Chicago's drinking water safe. It was the feat of the century sending the city's polluted waters downriver to St. Louis. Cholera and typhoid would follow. Thousands milled on the docks. Western Electric had invited its employees on this mandatory picnic across the lake to Michigan City. They made the receivers, amplifiers, and vacuum tubes for Bell Telephone. In the twine room, they sat on benches wrapping wires. That winter, Alexander Graham Bell, not Thomas Edison, dialed from his phone in New York, and his assistant, Thomas Watson, answered in San Francisco. These workers wove the cables. They came in droves, wives in creamy linen, paraded with their husbands in Panama hats. Rows of siblings in matching dresses and suits walked hand in hand. Little girls in pigtails wore satin ribbons in their hair, and budding young women worked on the assembly lines hung on the arms of their bows. Grandmothers chased toddlers, and a Hungarian man brought all his friends. Whiskey flasks were tucked into pockets. A sea of parasols floated by. It would require 5 ships to take them, and the Eastland was boarding first. Benny marveled at the state-of-the-art steamship with its white and gray hull and sparkling deck. The crew in navy jackets and sailor caps dazzled him. The Eastland was outfitted with the latest in life-saving equipment. 3 years before, the Titanic went down with lifeboats for fewer than half on board. Afterward, Woodrow Wilson signed the Seamen's Act. Lifeboats had to accommodate every man, woman, and child. Earlier that summer, extra rafts weighing 14 tons were added to the Eastland's top deck. The crew knew that she was top-heavy. The first officer shook his head. Because of the rain, many had gone below. Others stayed on top and danced. On the bridge above, Benny swayed to the rhythm of Bradfield's orchestra. The piano player was pounding out a tune on a shining Kimball upright. Couples glided along the promenade deck. They leaped to a polka, then a daring foxtrot, their smiles bright under broad-brimmed hats. The hats made Benny remember his errand. He glanced at the parcel in his hand. His father manufactured crisp white or heavy blue uniform caps that his sons distributed throughout the city. Every butcher and motorman in Chicago wore one of these. Today he had only one delivery on the north side, then he could play ball. He'd meet up with his pal Mo. In the afternoon they'd sneak into Comiskey Park to see the White Sox wallop the Yanks. Faber was pitching, and Benny wanted to be there, but he lingered. Off the bridge, a street vendor was selling sausage smothered in sauerkraut. If he had a nickel, Benny would buy one, even though it was trafe, but he didn't. He was mad at his father for not giving him more than one-way car fare when he went on his errands. His mouth watered as bohemian women passed baskets under their arms, filled with creamy potato salad, deviled eggs, chickens that had been slow roasting for days. He was tempted to tag along so he could sample what they had. Instead, he tipped his hat as the women sauntered by, and the men in gray jackets and starched shirts tipped their hats back at him. His hands clasped the railing and his package swung by a string. He tapped out the music his fingers heard as he went along, not the Chopin and Beethoven his mother wanted him to play, but the tunes that were caught inside his head. He heard his own music everywhere. It was in the movement of his feet on the wooden sidewalks, in the clomp of horses' hooves, in the clatter of the L. He banged it out in the garbage can lids and on his desk at school. In the morning he hummed in the tub. At dinner he held the beat with a knife and fork until his father ordered him to stop. Then he played on his sheets at night as he drifted to sleep. The music that came into his hands was different from the ragtime he listened to now. He heard his music on the deliveries he made to the neighborhoods where the black people lived. It came from behind closed doors or out lonely windows where men in white undershirts played the horn on summer evenings. Before they began running deliveries for Lerman's caps, Benny didn't know much about the world beyond the neighborhood where he lived, the White Sox for whom he rooted, and the piano he played. He had seen the first cars rumble down Chicago streets and heard that airplanes could fly. He knew the Great War had begun in Europe and that Wilson was president. That spring, the Lusitania sank in 18 minutes, killing most of the passengers on board. Anti-German sentiment spread throughout Chicago. In the western suburbs, dachshunds were being poisoned. But his delivery took him in a different direction, down the old fur traders' trail called State Street by some, and Satan's Mile by most. People claimed the devil lived downtown, but Benny wanted to go to the south side where the rail workers and meat packers lived. In the back alleys, the city was starting to roar. Hot music, he heard it called. In February, Joe Oliver and his New Orleans band had caused an uproar on the south side. They had had all those horns going at once. Joe Oliver was a big man with a wandering eye. Behind his back, the musicians called him cockeyed, but he had a sixth sense. Everything was about to change. Blacks and their music were moving north. They were building shacks along the tracks where the trains left them off. As the ballast tanks were emptied, Benny was tapping his tune. He hummed, trying to remember a refrain he'd heard. Water poured from the hull of the ship. Soon the gangplank was leveled with the river. Now the crowds climbed more easily aboard. The boat horn gave a deep, harsh honk. He dallied as any child would, waving from the bridge as if he were about to leave. Passengers rushed to starboard, raising their children. A nearby tug sounded its horn and they ran to port. Benny heard the laughter as the ship pitched under their weight. Shouts of goodbye rose from the crowd. They would only be gone for a day, but they acted as if this were a journey across the sea. It was 1915 and the city was safe. Except for accidents that happened in the streets because children had nowhere to play, there was little to fear. Doors were never locked. There were no thieves. Big Bill Thompson would soon be mayor, and George Wellington Streeter was selling home brew from a sandbar he claimed to rule as the District of Lake Michigan. Except for Sundays, liquor was legal. Gangsters, bootleggers, and pimps hadn't begun their rule. Benny's eyes caught those of a woman on the bridge. Her hair was the color of burning leaves, her body round as a plum. She came up on the Clark Street Bridge as he had for better view. The woman held a girl in each hand. The youngest was pale and fragile as a porcelain doll, and at first Benny mistook her for one. The older girl was dark with olive skin and looked grown up for her years. They were dressed in creamy linen and matching hats. "It's a beautiful sight, isn't it?" the woman said. "Yes, it is, ma'am." Benny replied, resting his arms on the railing. "I bet you were going with them." Benny nodded. "Yes, I do. My boys are." She pointed to 3 young men who were scampering up the gangplank as the crew motioned for them to hurry. It was 10 minutes after 7, and the gangplank was raised. The crew began turning others away and sending them over to the Theodore Roosevelt, which had already begun to receive them. The young men raised their fists in victory as their mother waved back. They were the last to board.
I have a cold. As you can tell, I'm sorry. And I don't have water for some reason. Oh, no, I do. Right here. Oh, my goodness. Sorry.
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bill. Yes, I'm Christina Baker Kline. So I have a novel that's currently out called Orphan Trade. I'm going to read you just a page, actually, a page and a half. The prologue for a book that I'm working on now. This new novel is inspired by a painting, Christina's World, by Andrew Wyatt. And it's the story of the woman in the painting. In this painting, if you don't know it, there's a woman in a pink dress in a field, a sort of barren field, looking at a gray house in the distance. And it's at the Museum of Modern Art. It's a wonderful painting. And I grew up in Maine, very close to where this house still exists, and is in fact part now of the Farnsworth Museum, which is a museum in Portland, Maine. This woman, Christina, existed as well. She is descended from John Hathorne, who was the presiding judge of the Salem witch trials. He was the only judge of the 3 magistrates who put 19 women to death, who never recanted. And when he put one of them to death, she put a curse forever on his family and on his soul. And so that's, I guess, the background. So this is the prologue of this book that I'm now in the middle of. Later he told me he'd been afraid to show me the painting. He thought I wouldn't like the way he portrayed me, dragging myself across the field, fingers clutching dirt, my legs twisted behind. The arid moonscape of wheatgrass and timothy, that dilapidated house in the distance, looming up like a secret that won't stay hidden. Those faraway windows, opaque and unreadable. Ruts in the spiky, dry grass made by an invisible vehicle, leading nowhere. Dishwater sky. He doesn't know me as well as he thinks he does. Like the crone in a fairy tale who casts a spell to make young men believe she's a beautiful maiden, I have made a fool of you. You want to believe the painting, but all is not as it seems. The picture is a fiction. He wasn't even in the field. He painted it from a room in the house, an entirely different angle. He removed rocks and trees and outbuildings. The scale of the barn is all wrong, and I am not that frail young thing, but a fierce, middle-aged spinster. It's not my body, really, and maybe not even my head. Those distortions and elisions obscure more than they reveal. I like that. Yes, the painting lies, but it tells a deeper truth. He pinned me to the canvas, capturing my desire and my hesitation, those oscillating aspects of my character. The four corners of the canvas frame the world of the painting. My world, he called it. There's truth in that too. I'm part of the land, crawling back into it. My hair is stiff grass. My skin, the color of the earth. My dress as bleached as bones in the sun. I am a line drawing in a children's book about evolution, the sea creatures sprouting limbs and inching toward shore. But that's just part of the story. I would not feel compelled to tell my own if he hadn't tried to show it himself. He only knows what he imagines. The reality is murkier and more complicated. I've spent my life yearning toward that house, wanting to understand its secrets, paralyzed by its history. My ancestors fled to Maine from Salem, but like anyone who tries to run away from the past, they brought it with them. You can never escape the bonds of family history, no matter how far you travel. Something inexorable seeds itself in the place of your origin, and the skeleton of a house can carry in its bones the marrow of all that came before. If you want to know me, you have to start with the witches, and then the drowned boys, the shells from distant lands, a whole room full of them, the Swedish sailor, marooned in ice. You need to hear about the underground tunnel that leads to Bird Cove, the false smiles of the Harvard man, and the hand-wringing of those brilliant Boston doctors. The dory in the attic, and the wheelchair in the sea. And eventually, we'll end up here, where we began, within and without the world of this painting. By that time, you should understand how to see what isn't there. Well, the painting was painted in the 40s. Yeah.
Gee, because I remember seeing it in the 60s and feeling like it was just a fresh new.
I know, it still feels that way.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
That's good. I love the part about can't get away from the past.
Yeah. No, it's great.
Yeah, which would happen to you when you decided to write about that.
Right.
And I was going to get away from that.
This is what came before what came.
Right.
I'm Valerie. It goes to the Mary Celeste. How many people have heard of the Mary Celeste? So few. It was a ship that turned up in 1872 off the coast of the Azores, and it's a great seagoing mystery because although the ship was in good condition, there was no one on board. The captain and his family were on board, his wife and a 2-year-old daughter, and 4 German sailors who were sailing the ship were all gone. There was no sign of violence. There was no reason for them to leave. The ship sailed around by itself for a few weeks and was finally picked up and brought in. So it was a great seagoing mystery, and in the process of trying to write about it, I kept running into other stories. And I ran right into Arthur Conan Doyle, who I did not expect to find there. But it turns out that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a solution to the mystery of the Mary Celeste in a short story that was an outrageous short story. And I have to tell you that he did not solve the mystery, nor did I. So it's not solved in this book. But thinking about a thing that we're going to talk about, which is writing historical fiction in which real characters occur. Certainly Andrew Wyatt is going to scroll across that field.
That's right.
With his fake paintbrush. You know, I have written historical fiction in which nobody who ever existed occurred, and I think that's one way to go, is to try to enter the period and not pay a whole lot of attention to the historical characters that we know were there. We try to find the characters who are alongside those characters. In a way, Mary does that a lot. She's got people like Al Capone, but the center of the novel is about people who are not involved in news that you would read in the daily papers. I'm going to read a little short section about Arthur Conan Doyle, if I can find it. Because before he wrote the story, he was an eye doctor, a young doctor, and he went to sea as a ship's doctor. He first went on a ship called the Hope to the Arctic, and he had a wonderful time. He loved clubbing seals. He loved going out after whales. He went out in the whaleboat. He helped with the harpoons. He was invited to come back, but he didn't. Instead, his next voyage was as a ship's surgeon or a ship's doctor on a trip to Africa. And he hated that trip. He was a big Scot, and he liked to be cold, and it was very hot, so he was not happy there at all. When he was on that ship, he met various people, but the ambassador to Liberia was on the ship. He remembers this in both letters to Holmes that I read, and also in his description of his autobiography. He remembers Henry Garnett, who was an American, sometimes he's described as the father of Liberia, abolitionist, very powerful and interesting man, who went to Africa. He was very ill. Principally, he went to Liberia to die. But what I noticed when I read about Arthur Conan Doyle is that he never mentioned two things about Garnett, which was that he was very ill and that he had one leg. But he did notice that he was well read. And then he read Oliver Wendell Holmes, right, and Prescott. He read some of Arthur Conan Doyle's favorite writers. In his autobiography, he says of his meeting with Garnett, that colored gentleman did me a world of good. He was a terrific racist, and he didn't get over it because he met William Garnett. But William Garnett shook him up a little bit. So this is a little scene that I wrote. It was interesting to me because I couldn't figure out when they could have been on the same ship, and I kept looking at dates, and then finally, one day I realized that it could only have been on the trip in which Garnett was going home to die, going to Africa to die. So here's my little scene. The Mayumba is the name of the ship. 2 days out of Las Palmas, the Mayumba lost the trades, and all sails set staggered through the tepid sea into a furnace. The sun, red with fury, hurled itself up, setting the very heavens ablaze. The sailors stumbled from the forecastle, stripped to their breeches, shoeless, their hair tied back in rags. The passengers had not the luxury of dishabille, and their only recourse, once they had accomplished the arduous task of dressing, was to sit very still beneath the dull whir of the fan blades that paddled the torpid air in the ship's saloon. Doyle sat in a stupor before a cup of tepid tea, his eyes resting on the bright cubes of sugar in the silver bowl. The pristine whiteness, the sharp architectural edges, put him in mind of the great ice floes that had hemmed in the Hope during his Arctic adventure. How their looming purity had fascinated him on those days without nights, when he strode the deck bristling with energy, alert to the tireless pumping of his own blood in his veins. Once the mate invited him to take the wheel, and he felt the whole quivering, breathing enterprise of the ship through the chilled flesh of his hand. Such light, such clarity, a world without shadow, in which to take a breath was to experience an influx of health. A dull whine near his ear materialized as a fly lazily circling the sugar cubes before landing on the edge of the bowl. After a moment of anthropoidal dithering, the creature set out upon the white landscape, maniacally working its spindly legs and rotating its compound eyes. A visceral revulsion caused the doctor to stretch his upper lip down and draw his head back on its stem as if he'd encountered putrefaction. Absently, his thumb and index fingers smoothed the surface of his mustache. It was damp. His eyebrows held back a line of perspiration. He could feel it gathering there. Though he made no decision to do so, his hand sought out his breast pocket and pulled forth the folded handkerchief, unfurling it like a flag and mopping his brow. A trickle of sweat escaped from the nape of his neck, rushed down his back, cooling him as the limp linen of his shirt absorbed it. The fly had gotten itself so jammed between two white cubes that it had actually managed to dislodge one from the other. Sadly, I report, snow cooler on deck, a voice informed him. I thought there might be a breeze. The doctor lifted his eyes to the frankly sweating visage of the American consul. It interested him that the black man's perspiration held together in round globules, which sparkled over the pores from which they issued. Did Negro skin perspire differently, or was it only the dark background that made the droplets appear to stand out so? "Hello, Garnett," he said. The American lowered himself into a chair, easing down from his crutches with practiced skill. "I don't think tea is the proper prescription for this climate," he observed, nodding at the half-empty cup. "No. What do you recommend? Coffee? That surely heats the blood." "I recommend water," Garnett said, "though I believe the preferred spirit of the British colonialists is gin." He grinned his toothy grin, like a bridge of yellowish stones connecting the white clouds of his sideburns, and raised his hand to the waiter who was unloading a tray of this very remedy at the next table. Although summoned by the black man, the waiter addressed his attention to the white. "Let us have a pitcher of tonic, a bottle of gin, and 2 glasses," Doyle commanded. As the waiter drifted away, his tray lifted above his shoulder in a show of youthful confidence, Doyle addressed his companion gloomily. "I take it you don't approve of the colonial enterprise?" Garnett chuckled, raising his eyebrows and bugging out his eyes, evidently delighted by this opening salvo. There was no offending the man, Doyle observed, nor was he capable of giving offense. He oiled his way through the world with a jovial brand of ironic courtesy. "I'm not against exploration," he began. "Who can speak against discovering the grand variety of the wide world? No, if the adventure is undertaken as a tourist, I approve that human impulse. I would be an explorer of foreign parts myself, if my health would bear it." "But when it's not so wonderfully various and grand," Doyle countered, "and one has the means to improve the lives of those who suffer needlessly." "Oh yes," Garnett interrupted. "You're speaking as a doctor and a healer. As such, you are welcome everywhere you go. But it isn't troops of doctors we see trekking through the underbrush with rifles and bayonets." Doyle smiled at the idea of troops of doctors. It didn't strike him as absurd. "Doctors," Garnett continued, "and tourists. These will improve the lives of the impoverished and the suffering in this great continent. But missionaries and soldiers we can do without." Doyle noted the pronoun. "So you see yourself as an African." Here the drinks arrived and were set down between them while the counsel indulged in a disturbing hoot of laughter. "Doctor," he said when he recovered his breath, "look at me." Doyle tipped a splash of gin into the glass and filled it with tonic. He was uncomfortable, and not just from the heat, though that was, he noted, astounding. Why should he have known that an emissary of the American government thought himself adequate to speak for all Africans, to say we need this and we do not do that? He glowered at the liquid in his glass. There was a dab of quinine in the tonic, not enough to ward off malaria, if indeed quinine was actually prophylactic, even in large doses. Garnett took up the tonic pitcher and filled his glass to the brim. "Yes, dear doctor," he continued, "even an African can be edified by the table talk of Mr. Holmes." Though there had clearly been an edge of hostility in this remark, when Doyle lifted his eyes, he found the self-proclaimed African gazing at the sleepily rotating fan blades with an expression of rueful melancholy. "I've traveled widely," he said, addressing the fan. "I've been to your country. Have you?" Garnett smiled and turned his attention to the doctor. "I'm a Presbyterian minister," he said. "The church in Scotland offered me its gracious hospitality some years ago. When I was a boy, I sailed to Cuba and Jamaica. I've traveled in England as well, but it's been the dream of my life to put my foot on the land of my ancestors. My father was a slave in Maryland, but his father was a Mandinka prince." So it was pride of descent. Pride of descent Doyle could understand. The sense of having come down, which he had imbibed at his own mother's breast. We are come down, that was the message. From the Plantagenets, from the Packs, from the Percys, from the Doylees. A lineage to be proud of, a family descended from the highest families, whose crests and seals variously connected, even to royalty, albeit his own family of 8 lived in 3 furnished rooms, and his father was confined to a madhouse. And here was Henry Garnett, looking beyond his own parents' tumultuous fall, come down all the way to slavery. clinging to the cherished family legend of an African prince, who, though he may have worn rings in his nose and danced with his subjects around a fire, served no man and was held in esteem by many. This was what made all the wit and good cheer possible. Garnet was a man among men, a rightful heir to an estate that he would, in time, regain and rebuild. You must be eager to arrive and begin your work, Doyle observed. Garnet was frowning at his glass. My work, he repeated, as if the word had a certain novelty for him. The fly, having pawed over every millimeter of the sugar cubes, hoisted itself into the rim of the bowl. Both men watched as it teetered drunkenly over the table, disappearing with a sudden cessation of its infernal buzzing engine into the pure white folds of the doctor's napkin.
So I'm going to ask some questions. I'm serving as the questioner here, and I'll just take a few minutes. So it's 7:45. I'm going to take 15 minutes and ask you some questions, and then we'll see if you all have questions, and then we can all get some wine. So my first question is, Mary, you've written, and this is for both of you, about what you call the interface of the historic and the personal.
Right.
And how, and so I'm interested in when things came together for you and how then you moved from maybe something you heard about or read about or that was personal to you in some way to writing this novel.
Right. I mean, I think we all begin our stories from some personal place. There's some reason why we pick the stories we tell. Full disclosure, when my father was 13 years old, he was crossing the Chicago River in 1915. He was born in 1902, and he saw the Eastland go over. And the thing about my father was born in 1902, and he lived till 2005. So if you do the math, let's just say that he was so old that when we ordered his heart medicine, the computer would default and think that we were trying to give heart medicine to a baby. So he lived a long time, and he saw everything. He would talk about everything. He was a great storyteller, but he would never talk about what he saw that day. He would hold up his hand as if he couldn't tell it. And my father was a secretive man. He played music. I was very interested in him, and yet he was a mystery to me. And when I started thinking about this novel, I always knew I wanted to start with the Eastland. I always felt there would be a boy crossing the bridge. But as I started to read, I mean, there's a moment where you sort of, that personal, it doesn't go away, but you sort of go deeper and deeper into the material, and it becomes a story of its own that you're starting to tell. It's like a marriage of those two things.
Yeah, I mean, same,
Similar, yeah.
same story for me. My father was a sea captain. I don't really need to say much more than that.
You could say more. It's fascinating.
Yeah. So I had read about the Mary Celeste in my school weekly reader, and I mentioned it at home, and he showed interest in the fact that I knew something about it, and he knew something about it, which was very unusual for him to show interest in anything that I had to say. So it stuck in my mind. Later he was interested in everything I had to say. He just didn't really show much about it. But so I had been thinking about it for years, and then I learned a few years ago that the wife and child of the captain were aboard the ship, and that was what caused me to say, go to my editor and say, how about this? And of course everybody was very excited that I was going to solve the mystery, but the deeper I got, the thicker it got, and really it's when you try to go back into history, these things that crop up, you find out nothing that seems as you described, and that everybody's got a different version of the story. In my case, I ran into the whole spiritualist movement, so I have a whole character who's clairvoyant involved in this whole Mary Celeste business. So it takes you for a ride, and you don't know. I've done several historical novels, and it's always like that. You go in thinking I'm going to go there, and you wind up
Takes you somewhere else.
So I was talking with Eric Larson about this recently, why he writes nonfiction about these kind of similar stories, actually. Lusitania is his new book. And I was wondering, actually, for both of you, why did you choose fiction when actually you have these riveting nonfiction stories that would have been very interesting books in that realm also?
Well, first of all, I love Devil in the White City. It was one of those books that inspired the Jazz Palace also. And I'm thinking of another nonfiction book called The Tiger by John Valiant. And those are two books of nonfiction. I think you introduced me to that book, actually. I love that book. They're nonfiction that read like novels. And yet they're true to the story that they're telling. I wanted to tell a story, and I didn't, it never occurred to me, lots of things have been written about the Eastland, lots of things have been written about the Jazz Age. There's an incredibly boring 150-page book called Jazz Clubs in Chicago, which I read every single word of 20 times, but I didn't want to rewrite Jazz Clubs in Chicago. And I think the moment for me came when the cultural historian of Chicago, who I wrote to, and I asked him if he would show me the south side of Chicago, and he took me down to projects and slums and nothing, and he would say, this is where the Vendôme was, this is where the Deluxe was, and there was nothing there. And I thought to myself, I don't want to write nonfiction, I want to tell the story of this place, of this city, and of the people who lived here. So it was never came to me as anything other than a story.
A story.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a question.
Why didn't you tell us nonfiction?
Why nonfiction? Yeah,
Why fiction?
I know why I'm walking. I don't think there is such a thing as nonfiction. And Mary said something in one of our email exchanges.
Right.
We've been going back and forth about story being everything. And when you read good nonfiction, the reason it's good to you is that it feels like a story and not like the clubs,
The Jazz Clubs of Chicago,
Yeah.
which I can give you my copy if anyone
Wants to know more.
And when I think of some of the stuff that I had to read in doing the research, I think, you know, how kind I have been to readers, what I've spared you. You didn't have to read all this stuff to get to the thing that attracted me, which is the story and how things so oddly connect. And then also, of course, there's the freedom in writing fiction that you don't have to document anything.
Right.
And that if you see a minor character who's attracted to you as you're looking through archives, you can go with that character and have them be the observer. But my tirade about historical fiction, which I won't read to all of, but it just has to do with it all. Talk about history, it has an agenda. Nobody writes about history without looking for a story and having a reason for it. Giving you a view that they believe to be the correct one. But it's always very...
There's so much grief when you go back in time. You have to do so much research, as you've just discussed. You have to be really accurate about a time period.
Right.
Why bother? Why not write a contemporary novel? Why did you even want to write a novel that took place in another time period that you would have to research and throw yourself into in this way?
I'm going to let Valerie start.
I think I'm a research person. I really, when I start to follow something, get interested in something, I really like to just do the research. And it takes a long time, and it's very boring, and it's very interesting. And it enlivens my memory. I don't find the contemporary world fun to write about. I certainly have done it, and will do it again, because nothing's gelled yet. And it's speculative. Not that historical fiction is not speculative, because it's speculative to think about what the past was like. You can't go there, you can't buy a ticket. It's not a place as a future. It's the same thing. So I could write about the future, but I feel much more comfortable.
I mean, as I said, I didn't really plan to do a book of historic fiction, and yet I think what happened was as I read this incredible biography of Al Capone, and I learned that he was a great dancer. And I started just envisioning Al Capone dancing, and I thought, and the more and more I got into it, and I suppose, again, maybe coming from my dad and my dad's love of music, I just got into the stories that I was reading, and the stories of jazz musicians particularly. There's one story I love where Milt Hinton, a wonderful bassist, he was 19 years old, he wasn't much of a musician then, and he was running liquor for Al Capone, and he was in an accident, and he almost lost his finger. He went to the emergency room, and the doctor said, "I'm cutting your finger off." And Milt Hinton pleaded with him and said, "Please don't cut my finger off." and the doctor said, I have to cut your finger off, and Al Capone walked into the emergency room and said, he's a musician, he needs his finger sewed back on. I love that stuff.
Wow.
You know, I just love that, and he sewed it back on, and Milton went on to be a great jazz musician. I mean, I've written a lot about now, and, you know, I feel like now hasn't gelled for us yet. You know, I feel like every time, it's sort of like buying new, like you buy a new charger and that one's already obsolete because you have to go get the next one. I feel like everything is changing so quickly, and the past you can imagine in a way that, I don't know. It's,
And also, it's something that you suggested, you read, the past doesn't let us go.
Yeah.
It's always rolling in some form or another.
Right.
It really is like a tide, and we're moving up the beach, but it's always full.
You're both writing about these historical events where people died and there were real people involved. There are descendants of those people. Do you feel, what kind of responsibility do you feel, or do you feel, to the truth, I guess, the facts? We can debate truth and facts, no doubt, but to the facts of what really happened in these moments, in these times, and where did you deviate from the facts? And how did you make those decisions? You could even just give an example of a time that you did it. I'd love to know.
I'm trying to think of it. I will, this is a moment where I like that quote from Dr. O, where he says, I research everything and then I sit down to write and I make it all up. And I think there is a way that, you know, the imagination, there's a moment where you have to sort of you try to stick with the truth, but you're not trying to be a journalist. I don't know where I've really deviated. I can't think of anything.
So you really did, your book is factually accurate.
Yes, I tried to do, because I read the jazz clubs of Chicago 3 times. Yeah, I think it is fairly factual, accurate.
Yeah.
But there's an anecdote I love that Russell Banks tells where he published Cloud Splitter, and he got a call at 11 o'clock at night from a woman who said, I'm looking for Russell Banks. And he said, this is Russell Banks, and she said, well, I'm your local librarian, and you have a bridge going across the Hudson, and there was no bridge there at the time. You know, you have your character, John Brown's going across the Hudson on this bridge. And Russell said to her, I needed a bridge. I feel like, you know, when you're writing historical fiction, there's moments where you need a bridge. So, and it all kind of melts together anyway, so.
Right, yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I don't really worry about what people's descendants might think.
Yeah.
And I'm more of I do all my research and then take off.
But the story, because it was very minutely detailed, it sounded like it was pretty accurate looking online at the description of what really happened. I went back after reading your novel to see what they found and if they did actually ever come out.
Yeah, pretty much everything that has to do with the Celeste is what we know.
Yeah.
And the family, the Briggs family from Buzzards Bay is pretty much intact. But I added a sister, so that's the one. And like Russell.
Violet?
Yeah,
Oh,
like Russell.
she's totally made up.
Yeah,
Oh.
like Russell Banks, I knew this.
You needed
You
a sister.
needed the bridge.
Right.
You needed the bridge, right.
Okay. I think, you know, there's emotional truth and there's historical truth. And I think there are times that you need to create an emotional truth and you may sacrifice certain historical details. And then they
I
become,
don't want to fuss at you, but people always talk about that emotional truth. I just don't know what that is. How can that be an emotional truth that's truer than a true truth?
well, that you might need to create a scene that may not historically be accurate, but it conveys something that you need to move your story forward, that needs to be, you know.
And
Right.
that's-
I don't want to have a fight with you up here.
I think that would be interesting, actually.
To have a fight?
Yeah. A little skirmish.
Yeah.
Valerie has been, we were going back and forth in emails about all of this, and you were so eloquent that I must quote you. Valerie talked about the necessary restraint that the writer of historical fiction must maintain toward characters who, like us, can't see into the future. Meaning that you've got these characters set in a time and place, and many times people who write historical fiction, I think we've discussed, fall into a kind of either a revisionist history, either, you know, a sort of perhaps a feminist wash or various lenses that they're seeing things through. that aren't accurate to the moment, and I would just ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, there's the one where every great thing a man ever did was actually done by a woman, including mix the paint. Right? That one about, is it Vermeer? Or
Yes.
something?
Yeah.
And it turns out that actually it was May who was responsible for his coloring,
First color, first palette. The first
Yeah,
colors.
first palette.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she had.
Girl with the pearl earring.
Yeah, she was great. So that's exactly what I mean, that it's the character who's been planted to tell us that the future is on its way. So that when I wanted to write about slavery, I tried to write about a totally unenlightened woman slave owner who had no vision that there was anything on.
Was that hard to
The
do?
way she lived? Yeah, I guess so, but,
Right, so the character couldn't know ahead of the moment that you were writing it.
yeah. So the way I think about it when I'm writing is, they can't see me coming. And I like that feeling of being, here I am in the present, in a world that they cannot imagine the world that we're in. And I think all three of us can.
I think that actually,
Right. It's really
that,
interesting.
That's what's really, both of the books are wonderful in that, and the characters have no vision of the future.
Right,
They live like we live, day by day.
in the moment, right.
I actually wasn't going to comment, but I think I have to, because that crystallizes something for me. I got a lot of books to blurb because I've written a novel that takes place in part in the past. And what I find cloying about many of them is that there's this gloss of exactly what you're talking about, a kind of either revisionist history or a we're yearning toward the future, here's where the future is, right around the corner feeling.
We're
And it's-
marching.
Yeah, and the women, power to women, whatever it is, it feels like is overlaid in a way that doesn't feel organic.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what we know about living in the present, is that you go through your days, you may have hopes for the future, you may even try to work for the future, for your kids, but the future is black. It's the grave, as far as you're concerned.
Yeah.
And behind you is black too, so we're just in these little.
And that's why in Ragtime there's that wonderful moment when the little boy, I can't remember if he says this to Houdini, maybe someone will remember, warn the Archduke. And if you remember that moment, this little boy has like this, he's sort of a psychic little boy, and he goes up to a character and says, warn the Archduke, because he has this vision of the World War I coming. I think you could have like a psychic character who has that sort of can see into the future. But, when I was writing about jazz in Chicago, I couldn't write about it from the point of view of characters who thought that one day these would be projects in slums. They wrote about it that it was going to go on forever. It was going to be bright lights and people listening to live music, for example. They didn't envision that live music would be replaced by the jukebox. And that was one of the things that really killed live music in the clubs, was once the jukebox came in. It was one of the very important, that and the Depression and certain other things, but that was one of the major things that killed live music.
That's great in your novel. When you watch it start to appear and nobody realizes.
Right.
Yeah.
Like video stores, like where are the video stores?
They're gone.
There aren't any video stores now. Nobody saw that coming, so it's kind of that kind of thing. So-
And people at the time were freaked out about video stores replacing movies.
Right.
And that people wouldn't go to movies anymore.
Right.
All of that.
Right, so we can't, and it was one of the things writing about jazz was that they didn't know what I knew.
Yeah.
And there wouldn't be a story if they knew what I knew.
Which makes it very hard. You have to have a lot of restraint, I would think, to do that.
It's also what moves your story along though also, because you kind of know where this is going. It's not good.
And you know your reader knows it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay, so we're it's past 8 already, it's past 8:05. I'm gonna ask one more question and then we'll see if anybody has a question. Mary, you have written about how you listened to jazz constantly as you were writing the book,
Right.
and it was really an influence for you, very inspiring as you worked. And I wonder if you would talk about that, and I'd also love to hear, Valerie, if there were things that stimulated you as you worked on this book, in particular either visually or orally or another way.
Well, I think my husband and my parrot, because I have a parrot also, knew when I was working on my book because the house was full of jazz. And the music was just, happening all around me. Jazz eluded me, it still eludes me. I'm not really clear that I could articulate it. But what happened was the compositions of jazz, I feel, entered the structure of the novel. So that the novel has riffs, it has interweaving themes, it has solos, it has ensemble moments. And there was a moment where I realized that, okay, I can't tell you what it is, but I know it's happening here. And so that was really the importance of having the music playing all the time for me, was it entered me in that way. It wasn't conscious, unconsciously.
Did you feel it affected the rhythm of your words?
Oh,
your
totally.
writing? How, in what way?
It made it looser. It was, I felt like I could, improv. I mean, the thing about jazz is that it's improvisation within a form, right? And I had the form, but I let things, it just made me freer. It's a great thing to listen to when you're writing,
Yeah.
actually, doing anything. But, no, it definitely made a difference.
Yeah, I have a little music, and I can't remember the composer, maybe somebody can, it's called The Thinking of the Titanic.
Whoa.
It's a contemporary composer, and it kind of goes, it's the song that they sang, the Titanic was going on, that they sang on the decks as it was sinking. And it's very watery, and there's also a Philip Glass piece that's very watery, so I listen to watery music.
Very depressing,
dark,
Valerie.
It's very dark.
Yes.
It's good music. It's very
Very great. Okay. Let's open it up and see if anyone has another question for these two fabulous. You have the opportunity.
Larry.
I have a question in the back. I'm curious about, you touched on technology, and I wonder if you could each talk about how it is. One of the things I like about meeting each one of you is I get a strong sense of how comfortable you are without, the smartphone or with, even the television. Is it, in Valerie, your case, with so much of work with journals, just in terms of writers, like being able to sort of immerse yourself in the word and in the journal when it was so much the currency we're talking about, we don't know anything, when a lot of the characters that we're writing about, are in your case, pre-television, it's like in terms of the narrative is the word on the page, and just how you can be drawn to it as writers, perhaps as a genre, because it speaks to us so.
One of the things that spoke to me a lot early on was the actual telegraphs that came back when they picked up the Mary Celeste.
Right.
And the whole thing about when the telegraph was invented, everything changed. And the first one was before the Civil War, was just the Continental Telegraph, which is the one that you guys were working on the lines across the United States. And then the Civil War broke out, and they were working on the transcontinental, but they had not the transoceanic. And then after the war, they finished the one to Britain. And that was when the first telegraph. Within a couple of years, it took off. So that if you read Tolstoy, their wives, one of the wives is complaining about how her husband keeps sending her telegrams from Ikon Karenin, about the election in Moscow. She said in Ukraine. So to me, that no technology, I love the thought of living without it. I sort of remember living without most of it, but that telegraph, that was big.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I think about a lot is how certain plot points are no longer available to us because of,
You have to lose the phone.
yeah, because, I mean, for example, I think it's Dial-In for Murder where he picks up the phone and listens in on the conversation, or she picks up the phone. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. My daughter has a friend who accidentally sent a sexual text to her father. Yeah, and I mean, those are new plot points. That's a new plot point.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That couldn't have happened a long time ago. So I mean, it is how it becomes, a character in our narratives. I mean, I have to say I write by hand as much as possible, and I feel that the hand is the extension of the brain, like literally, neurologically, and so that the connection between my hand and a pencil or pen and paper is really crucial. So I try not to bring technology into my process too much, and try to let, I know you were, and I try to think of technology as being a part. Do you write by hand? Yeah. There you go, old-fashioned girls.
That's weird. That's really weird.
Well, I'm
Most people do
delighted.
this.
I have some students now who just, when they're frustrated, just get a pen out and write by
says, "Under this tree, Tasso wrote whatever." And I thought, oh, I just want to sit under this tree and write something, you know, but of course you could have a laptop now, you could be charged. You know, but I mean, I had a student who was going to India, and I said, "What are you taking with you to India?" And he said, "I'm taking a laptop," and it was all technology. And I said, and when he came back, he said, "You know what? The electricity went out, and I had to go buy a school book and write, you know, a school book." So,
But I agree with you about the hand and the brain.
I really think neurologically, you know,
Forming your letters.
you know, I'm an amateur palm reader, and I really believe that what is in the hand is actually part of the brain. We can discuss that later.
That's another whole topic here.
But I really believe that, and I think that the physical act of, whether it's painting or writing or music, is, you get to the things later.
So I have a comment and a question. First, Mary, when you asked about the jazz, or Christina, you asked about the jazz, the first note I wrote after you read your first sentence was the syncopated beat.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
In the prose and the riffing quality too. This is a question for all of you, and I don't mean it just in a definitional sense, but how old does something have to be historical fiction? Right? You know, is writing about the 1960s historical fiction, is writing about the 1970s. And
My students think it is. To them, it's historical.
It is, and I ask that because it has to do with the question of, in a sense, how different is historical fiction from any fiction in which you're imagining yourself into a different world than the one you feel like you know, without having to do any research or thinking about it or investigating.
Yeah, I think in a general way, it could be any world that you're imagining yourself into is going to be, you know, something you don't know anything about. But I've taught courses in writing historical fiction, and I always make the line, "If it happened before you were born." Historical fiction.
So your historical fiction might be different from
So my
someone
students
else's.
write about the 60s.
Right.
And I
But
try to
they have the
and I'm
version.
surprised-
That's
and I'm
good.
surprised at how different their 60s are than the one I remember.
I would say that your personal life begins with the memories of your grandparents, which stretches actually pretty far back.
Right.
I thought about that for both of you because you were talking about stories that were really seminal for your fathers.
That's true.
Joyce Carol's once said that sometimes our lives are governed by the stories of people we never even knew. And I think she's talking about ancestors and kind of the way generationally our stories compile to make us who we are.
Right.
Is there another question? There's a question there?
No, I was going to respond to that. I lead the New York chapter of the Historical Fiction Society.
Oh,
And we've discussed that point many times, and there are two kinds of answers. Either 30 or 50 years, or what you said, before you were born. That's usual.
but then I think of my dad, you know, would have had to go way back before you were born. I think that's a good way to. But of course, then I think about Mad Men and how they get the clothes right. You know, like every time that the era changes, those 70s outfits are just awful. You know, but those kinds of details that you have to get right when you're doing anything historical or period. You know,
Yeah, it could be one of your
yeah.
Oh, shit, you had a question first.
Actually, it's actually a comment more than a question. First, I want to say that I really love historical fiction. No matter how long it is, as long as it's not contemporary or like of today, I like it because you learn so much from the past. And I like what Mary said about the emotional truth. And as well as the revisionist part. Like when you tell a story, when you tell a story that's historical, it is for a reason. So it's like, you don't, I think, try to distort it, but you just try to see it through your eyes. You know, you see it in like a different way than maybe society or the culture frames it. So for you, it's like personal,
Right.
I think. So
I think that's definitely true, and I guess what Mary means about the emotional truth is what draws you to the story is going to be personal. And so there's no way that you can write about it objectively. But I think that's true of historians as well. They just don't admit it.
Right.
thank you.
Yep.
After this one, I think that's gonna be the last
Okay.
question.
Okay.
This is just a practical question. I was just wondering if you all have like tips or what kinds of ways have you organized all your information as you go about writing? Do you strain along on a clothesline? What kinds of things do you do to help make the process easier?
Or do you use charts or something?
Am I allowed to talk?
Yeah,
I was on. Yeah. I'll just tell you what I'm doing with this book, because my last novel, people think is a historical novel, but it is not. It is narrated by a woman in the present day. She's telling the story of her own life, but she's telling it in the present day. And the other part of the story, 2/3 of it, actually takes place in the third person in the present day. So, but this novel, I suppose, is historical, though it really takes place in the mid-20th century, and I have a question myself about whether that counts as a historical novel at all. However, regardless of how it's how the category, it required a lot of research, and the real life of this person is actually fascinating, and there's a lot there that I'm really interested in and would like to use. Not to mention the fact that Wyeth is a famous person of whom a lot is written, and there are many, many books about his obsession with this woman and with his painting, undertaking this painting. So what I did is I read a lot of books, I took a lot of notes. I compiled for myself a kind of 50-page single-spaced story of her life with his with high points and low points that I am and I'm not using. And it's really useful. It's just, I have hammered out this narrative, I guess, of my story that has these true life, real occurrences that happened, that are documented by Merrill and other, like by his biographer, by Christina Olsen's niece, by all these other people, and as much as possible, I'm weaving in that stuff, but it's in the first person and it's her story, as you have heard, and so it's very singular and personal, and her voice is distinctive, and she doesn't have a voice in the world. She never really spoke, so in a public way. So I have a lot of freedom, and that's what I love. So I have these touchstones, but I also have all this freedom. It feels wonderful, actually. I like that combination.
It's a great idea. Thanks.
I just think for me it's very organic. I'm not very organized, and things just lie all over my office. But I have an enormous bulletin board, and sometimes I'll put a timeline up or something like that. The other thing I do is if I have different timelines, I'll print them on different colored paper, and that really helps me to see where things fit in terms of time. It's a little expensive to get all that different colored paper, but I like it.
It's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
It is a good idea, right? You've got the present time, like sometimes I'll have
Very
three timelines.
specific. Yes.
Yeah, it really helps.
Yeah.
So, to me, it's like a mosaic, a little bit moving pieces around more than, it's not very organized.
So me too, I just have piles of books and I take lots of notes and I never can find the one I want.
Right.
I did do a couple of little timelines, but then they weren't right, and I had to change everybody's age at one point.
Oh, yeah.
But it's very, this book covers a long period that I've never done before, so I did have to make sure people were still alive and hadn't been born, so that they could meet. I was mostly interested in the places where people could meet, and my only reason to adhere to really factual stuff was, could they have been in the same town at the same time?
At the same time.
Yeah.
Right, you get them alive. Right, you get them alive at the same town at the same time. They can meet.
You just gave me a great idea.
Oh, there you